There's a small town in rural Ohio called Swanton, and it has a population of 3,870. Not a lot of people. I don't know much about this small town, but I do know that there's a good chance that somebody there is struggling with their sexuality. Imagine you're that person, a resident in a town with only 3,870 people. Imagine trying to come to terms with your own sexuality and figure out ways to navigate your small Ohio town with that realization. You probably don't have any support, whether that's from your school or your parents or other residents of Swanton. You don't have any. But then you meet someone who's just like you, and you finally have somebody that you can talk and relate to. But you live in Swanton, Ohio, and word travels fast with only 3,870 people. So now you and your partner have to live there, expressing yourself only in secrecy. If only you grew up in a bigger town, bigger city, Cincinnati maybe, you'd be more comfortable there. Or maybe somewhere off in California. That'd be nice. But regardless of where you are, you still have to navigate the world as queer, whether you live in Swanton, Ohio, or somewhere off in California.
The movies that we watch know that, and they use those places to show how queer people traverse the world, and how it's different from how non queer people do. Jack and Enos, two characters from the movie Brokeback Mountain, go through a similar experience to what may happen in rural Ohio, except for the fact that Riverton, Wyoming is a much different place than Swanton. Another couple, Elio and Oliver in the movie Call Me By Your Name, experienced something totally different during their summer in Italy, a far cry from both Swanton and Riverton. Both movies are about two men falling in love, but both of those couples express themselves incredibly differently, and much of that can be derived from where the movie takes place. The settings in both Brokeback Mountain and Call Me By Your Name affect how both of those couples express or repress their sexuality. Spoilers for both Brokeback Mountain and Call Me By Your Name if you haven't seen them. The first movie, Brokeback Mountain, was directed by Ang Lee and released in 2005. It takes place in the rural country town of Riverton, Wyoming. The movie's set during the 60s and follows two cowboys, Jack and Enos, that take a job herding sheep through the mountains. They fall in love while on the job, and they have to part ways after the job is finished at the end of the summer. They meet each other again after a couple years, and despite both being in committed relationships with women, they hit it off. Jack and Enos continue to see each other throughout the rest of their lives, and the movie ends after Jack is killed in Texas by a group of cowboys that figured out he was gay. We see plenty of struggle throughout both Jack and Enos' lives, torn between the lives they live and the lives they want with each other. I think that setting is one of the most important subjects in this movie because Wyoming isn't actually depicted in movies often, which highlights its significance. Wyoming and rancher culture in general are against the idea of men being together, or at least from what we see in the movie. We see multiple people, including their former boss, insult and degrade Jack and Enos for their sexuality. There's also a scene with Enos as a kid, and he's shown a dead cowboy lying in a gutter, killed by others who found out they were gay. Wyoming is obviously not very kind to gay men, and that includes Jack and Enos. Halfway through the movie, Jack moves to Texas with his wife to get away. The distance that the move creates physically reflects the emotional distance that grows between Jack and Enos. The places they work and live in are rural, compact, and constricting, which echoes the dissonance they feel while there. And the film reflects that with its muted color palettes. Wyoming may be oppressive, but Brokeback Mountain itself is a complete change of scenery for the two. The landscape is incredibly different from Riverton, and the retreats that the two go on throughout the movie are the few times that they're able to freely express themselves, alone and isolated from everyone. Whenever Jack and Enos travel to Brokeback, it's always during the summer season when it's warmer out. While they're in Wyoming, though, it's usually much colder, and they spend more time at work during those months away from each other. This movie's setting provides a reason why these characters might not be able to express themselves. But this isn't the only way that setting can be used in a movie. Call Me By Your Name is a 2016 movie directed by Luca Guadagnino, and it's about the relationship between an anthropologist's son and his student. They meet during a hot 80s summer in Italy and become intimate not too much later. There's not much plot-wise happening in this movie. It focuses largely on the 17-year-old Elio and the 24-year-old Oliver. And despite the age gap between the two, they're still together over the summer. Throughout this movie, we can see instantly how this movie's scenery differs from that of Brokeback Mountain. It is much warmer, the plants and landscape seem more alive, and Italy as a country is already very romantic. Having a love story in Italy is apparent, and not nearly as obvious as a love story in Wyoming. The imagery of apricots, eating outside, and swimming lend to the idea of Oliver and Elio being more free because their landscape feels so much more welcoming. The color grading of this movie is warmer, and there's some grain on screen that's reminiscent of older Italian films. Even the language present in this movie is romantic. Elio's able to speak both French and Italian, which are both considered very romantic languages. Wyoming and Italy are clear opposites in how they are represented to the audience, and it correlates to how the relationships in those settings are represented as well. The age gap that I mentioned earlier is a big problem for some of the audience. Elio being 17 and Oliver being 24 is pretty predatory, but I think most of the people watching excuse that age gap because it takes place in Italy. If this movie were made or set somewhere in the US, I'm confident that the movie would not be getting the reception that it has since its release. The age of consent in the US is 18, so that would be statutory rape if Call Me By Your Name took place on this side of the Atlantic. For Italy, though, the age of consent is 14, so Italy is an extremely important setting considering their laws are what make this story possible. That's probably the reason why Oliver tries this relationship out with Elio, because this experience isn't allowed in America where he's from. The setting in Call Me By Your Name continues to be important in defining the experiences these characters lead, from tone to legality. Anyways, I think one of the most important things to consider when looking at these two movies is their time period. Brokeback Mountain takes place across multiple decades, but begins in the summer of 1963 when Jack and Enos's relationship started. The 1960s were not very kind towards queer people, especially men. The movie shows this extensively with the dead cowboys we discussed earlier, and compared to the 1980s in Italy, this time period is much harsher for Jack and Enos throughout their lives. For Call Me By Your Name, we only see the 17 and 24-year-olds during one summer when their romance is starting. We don't see their entire lives on screen, nor the fear of being discovered as homosexual, because it only takes place during a summer. These differences in time periods allow us to see how much more encroaching life in Wyoming is compared to what the summer in Italy might be like. These movies take place in opposing seasons too. The summer in Call Me By Your Name is hot, warm, and more intimate than a lot of the imagery in Brokeback Mountain. Oliver and Elio are shirtless for a good portion of the movie, and the lack of heavy clothes reflects their freedom. The sheer amount of swimming they do to cool off from the heat is showing the intimate moments between Elio and Oliver, whether it's swimming in the small pool or the creek that Elio frequents. For Jack and Enos in Brokeback Mountain, the only times they're truly able to express themselves are when they're alone on their fishing trips. The heat, water, and isolation allow the cowboys to feel more free, stripping to jump in the water during one of their trips. During the winter months, even when they're together, they have to hide themselves a little more, wearing heavier clothes to fit into the cowboys that surround them. Elio and Oliver don't have to do that as much, because Italy is much similar to those retreats. Down on the ranches and towns in Wyoming, it feels like the buildings and landscape are extremely flat, and that no matter where you are, someone can always see you. In straight westerns, the flat expanse of Wyoming is seen as free, a massive swath of land to be explored, but for Jack and Enos, that same expanse is constricting. That's why the two retreat to the mountains so often, where they're obscured and unseen. The houses they live in feel suffocating too, especially Enos's apartment, and that reflects the pressure that Enos always feels there with his family. Again, this isn't a problem in Italy. The landscape feels much more isolated there, and the buildings are built as if to obscure Elio and Oliver from everyone else. Their home is always much more open, allowing sunlight, air, and intimacy to come in easier. And two places that these romances find themselves feel like new and different worlds, and despite the relationships being similar, one reflects love and hope, and one reflects tragedy. Only when the winter comes in Italy near the end of Call Me By Your Name and the cold crowds itself around Ilio is when we feel the loneliness and disparity that plagues Jack and Enos constantly in Wyoming. Intimacy in Call Me By Your Name is derived from expression, and it's a soft sweetness that permeates the setting and how the movie feels. For Brokeback Mountain, that same intimacy is derived from secrecy, or the lack of that expression. The intimacy that Jack and Enos have comes out of just as much love as Oliver and Elio, but is restrained and much rougher in how it presents itself in the movie.
Intimacy in a place like Swanton, Ohio, is going to be a complete contrast from either of those two movies. Those 3,870 people will shape an experience so much different than either Wyoming or Italy. Expression is tethered so close to setting that it's almost impossible to separate a queer experience from where that experience takes place. Whether that's in rural Ohio, the peaks of mountain ranges in Wyoming, or the villas and orchards of Italy, queer people have such a huge burden of understanding their surroundings. Because if they don't have that understanding, 3,870 people might outcast them. Setting makes its mark on everyone, but for LGBTQ plus people, and in these two movies, specifically gay men, they have to look at themselves and their identity through their surroundings in order to survive. It doesn't matter whether they're doing that in Swanton, Ohio, or somewhere off in California.